Hi everyone, my name is Ella Lewis, and for my final research paper, I have decided to research Elizabeth Bishop. Before coming into this course, I honestly did not know much about poetry at all. In high school, I didn't have very many poetry units, and those that we did have were very concise and short. I grew up on some poetry like Shel Silverstein, but I was not familiar with a lot of the very popular poets that we had talked about. So this course was very interesting to me, and I honestly learned a lot. So today I'm going to be talking about Elizabeth Bishop and how her poetry handles emotion in a different kind of way that feels different from a lot of writers in the same time period. What stood out to me most about Elizabeth Bishop is that she doesn't elaborate specifically on what she's trying to say. She focuses more on building emotion through observation, structure, and smaller details. So, one of my main findings when researching Bishop was that a lot of her work cannot be read explicitly. You are going to be challenged by a lot of her work, and it is not something that you can just understand off of first glance, but rather something that she wants you to interact with and read really truly for what it's worth. And I feel like it makes it a lot more worth it in that way because you get to sit and make more personal connections and inferences, and by the end, it just carries a lot more emotional weight because you actually had to work to get to the final result of that. And to understand why this matters, it helps to look at some other poets that we discussed that were writing during the same time period. Before getting into Bishop's separate works, I think it's really important to understand the differences and the similarities between different poets at the same time that were writing in the same time period as Bishop. I like to compare Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton with her because they used very confessional writing pieces and they were very explicit with their meaning. The emotion was very heavy and it hit very hard, but it was pretty direct. It wasn't necessarily that they were telling you what you were supposed to be feeling, but it gave a clearer meaning to the emotion. And so I feel like it was easier to draw conclusions from their work quicker. On the other hand, I feel like Bishop was very indirect with hers, but it's similar in a way that it's almost opposite. She describes detail very vaguely, but by the end, when you draw the connection, it's a big aha moment. She doesn't clearly connect the speaker to herself, and she doesn't directly explain emotions in a lot of her pieces, but instead she focuses on letting observation and detail build up over time. And at first, this can make her poems feel a little bit less emotional and less touching than Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath's work, but I actually feel like it makes her a more competitive figure because she leaves it up to the reader to feel what they want to feel and make own personal connections if they want to, and if not, leave it up to her. And I feel like that's really important. I think it makes it feel more realistic because in real life, emotions don't always appear clearly or they're not necessarily easy to explain. You don't always know what you're feeling right away, and I feel like Bishop's poems do a really fantastic job of representing that. I tried to set up the poems that I analyzed in kind of a gallery walk manner to give a different kind of visual component so that it's easier to highlight some of the key ideas in the poems so that they're easier to reference, but also so that we can look at some of the lines that I noted specifically. Starting off in One Art, I noted specifically the repetition and the change of meaning throughout the poem. We start off with the very first line, "The art of losing isn't hard to master." Throughout the poem, it changes a lot, but at the beginning, we start off kind of controlled, just losing smaller things like keys or just wasting time, something that I feel like we all probably do. It keeps the control in the beginning, but as the poem continues on, the losses become much larger and much more personal by the end, especially in the line, "Write it." The interruption there, it's feels like the speaker is struggling to keep the control that we started with in the very beginning. That moment really changed how I view the poem because it exposes the kind of effort that was put into the calm tone of the poem. It no longer sounds confident, but rather forced. I feel like what I connected most was the idea that people often repeat to themselves not because they necessarily believe what they're saying, but because they're trying to convince themselves of what they're saying is true. And I feel like Bishop connects and represents that human emotion very clearly in this poem. While One Art focuses on controlling loss, The Fish approaches emotion in a much quieter way through different kinds of observation. Like I said about The Fish, Bishop builds meaning in this poem almost entirely through description and through reliance on observation of the reader of the poem. At first, the speaker just seems to be observing the fish like in a very detached manner, describing details of the skin like ancient wallpaper or the scars and hooks that are attached to it. The fish almost feels completely objectified. There are no strings attached. There's no emotion behind a lot of this. It's strictly an objectified observation. But the longer the speaker looks at the fish, the more details begin to come out and begin to matter. The fish starts to feel less like an object and more like something that has a story and something that has survived a lot. And this shift specifically, it leads to the final line, I let the fish go. What I liked most about this poem is that Bishop never directly explains why the fish was let go. The meaning comes from the buildup of observation, and I think that reflects Bishop's larger writing style, where understanding develops gradually rather than being directly stated. We see this same emotional style appearing in other works such as Sestina, but through repetition and family dynamics instead of observation alone. Sestina was one of the works that actually interested me the most because of the different kind of structure that Elizabeth Bishop used. I didn't really know what a villanelle poem was before reading this poem, but including it in my work, that was part of my reflection, is that this was a villanelle structured poem. It's 39 lines, strictly 6 lines per stanza until the last stanza, and the last stanza is 3 lines. I feel like it's the most interesting to me because of the repeated words in this that also create the feeling of being emotionally stuck, especially given the structure of the poem, how rigid it is. The poem itself seems pretty simple on the surface, I feel like. It's just a grandmother and a child sitting in a kitchen, but the repetition of the words grandmother, house, child, and especially tears create this constant feeling that sadness is lingering underneath everything that is going on. The line that I focused on in this essay was buttons like tears, which is describing the buttons that the little girl drew on a man's coat. It shows the emotion and how it exists indirectly throughout the poem, and the innocent nature of a child where they cannot fully explain the feeling of grief, but it still represents itself symbolically in the drawings. Even objects around the room begin to reflect emotion. What I found most interesting is that no one openly talks about sadness in the poem, but it feels emotionally heavy and sad the entire time because of the different words that are used to describe sadness. And I feel like that felt realistic to me because grief is often very repetitive and often unresolved rather than being clearly expressed or dramatically expressed. I feel like Bishop explores a different kind of emotional confusion in this piece, but also especially in the waiting room, where the focus shifts from grief to forms of identity. In the waiting room was actually the one poem that I couldn't find a compressed enough version to include into my PowerPoint that would not make it look overly crowded. So I do apologize. This is only a snippet of In the Waiting Room, but I'm still going to discuss the lines that I found most interesting and what stood out to me most within this poem. In the Waiting Room, Bishop focuses specifically on a childhood moment where the child becomes aware of herself in a way that feels overwhelming, especially for the age. Another thing that stood out to me most was this setting and how simple it is at first. We're just starting off in a simple waiting room, just flipping through a magazine that feels very irrelevant in the moment, but it actually leads to a bigger picture and a much larger realization about identity in this poem. The line specifically, "You are an I, you are an Elizabeth," really captures that feeling for me. Bishop uses you instead of I, which makes the moment feel kind of distant and disorienting, and also, again, leaves it up to the reader of more of a personal inference on that, which makes the moment again feel distant. Almost like the speaker is stepping completely out of herself and looking at herself. I think this poem connects strongly to Bishop's overall style because she never fully explains the meaning, which is what we see in a lot of her poems. She focuses on the experience itself and lets the reader sit in that confusion alongside the speaker, which I think is very real. Looking into all of these poems together, a clear pattern begins to emerge in a lot of Bishop's writings. After researching and being able to compare a lot of these poems together and also to other poets that we have analyzed throughout this semester, I have realized that Bishop's poetry consistently depends on restraint and structure and a lot of observation rather than direct emotional confession. Even though her poems are quieter than a lot of confessional poetry, they still feel deeply emotional because the reader has to actively engage with the details to understand what's happening. I think that's why her work stuck with me while I was writing this essay, because it truly forced me to go line by line, make my own inferences, create my own connections, and feel the emotions personally. The emotions in her poetry feel like they've been discovered at the end of the poem rather than just being announced or being thoroughly explained. Rather than telling the reader something about what something specifically means, she allows the reader to build that meaning slowly over time within themselves. That idea is what ultimately shaped the main conclusion of my analysis on Bishop's work. To conclude, I would like to say that I had a great time getting to experiment with different poets during this semester. I think that I learned a lot from Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, and now especially Elizabeth Bishop. I feel like her and I probably would have a lot in common. I saw a lot of myself in my own emotional representation through her work, and I feel like it felt nice to be represented in that way, in a way that was very human. I feel like Bishop's poetry shows that emotion doesn't have to be direct to be meaningful. The quotes that I looked at show what matters most when it often isn't being fully explained. Instead of telling the reader exactly what they should feel, she creates moments where meaning develops on its own, truly, throughout the poems, and that makes her work stand out to me. My research led me to conclusion that Bishop's poetry proves emotional strength and depth, and does not always require direct confession. Through repetition and structure, observation, and other small details, she creates poems that feel realistic and emotionally complex without fully explaining themselves. Across One Art, The Fish, Sistina, and In the Waiting Room, Bishop consistently allows emotion to emerge gradually instead of directly stating it and telling you what you should be feeling. Personally, I feel like that's what has made her lasting mark on me, and I hope that you can feel that lasting mark within yourselves as well. The poems leave room for the reader to think, interpret, and connect their own experiences to what's happening. And I think that that's very important, especially for this time. I hope you all enjoyed listening to my presentation on Elizabeth Bishop. I had a great time exploring her work, and thanks for a great semester.